Hello and welcome to another BuildASoil FAQ video. Today we have FAQ 11 for season 4. I'm just going to read through them one by one for the first time so we can get some live kind of questions instead of me planning for it. I hope that it answers your guys' questions. If you have more, load them up on this video. We want to keep doing FAQs forever. All right, FAQ 11, season 4. This one's titled Problems. Bro, I had hella fungus gnats this last round. Mustard seed did not work. Dr. Zymes did not work. Peroxide did not work. EM5 did not work. BB did not work. It's like every time I top dress with castings or build a flower or anything, it just got worse. Even started a dry down schedule, risking my microbes, and even that didn't work. I actually drilled myself in the face trying to swat these things away. And it's got like an emoji of a crying, laughing face. As funny as that sounds, this is a real problem. And I will admit it's kind of a mild problem as far as getting the results that we're looking for, but it's the elephant in the room. It's something that as a living soil grower, if you're gonna get your buddy involved in it, it's good to have a conversation with him about gnats because it's a reality. Fungus gnats absolutely love compost, they love worm castings. And so not only is it possible that you might have a little bit of larva in that casting material, it's also just a really attractive home for them. So if there's gnats around your property anywhere, you've got that bag of castings open, or when you're top dressing, if they're already there, it's almost like feeding them. And so I've got a couple of things that I'm gonna make some recommendations on. We should probably do a whole separate video on just fungus gnats. But number one, lots of things will not work against fungus gnats. Mustard, it has the potential to work, but if you miss one, once that enzyme reaction is done, now it's good food for anything, and it grows a ton of biology in the soil, and fungus gnats like that stuff. The number one approach, so if you're watching this and you're like, me too, I've had this happen, the good news I will tell you is that a lot of us living soil growers have experienced this, and we've gotten to a point where we've learned to keep it down to a minimum. I won't say that I'm able to walk in and completely eradicate it. There's fungus gnats in every grow that I've had in all YouTube series. There's been a few flying around. The good news is that it never got out of control where I'm in there like swatting them out of my face and they're flying in the buds. And so if you've got a couple, it's okay, especially if we have a diverse ecosystem. What I mean by that is there should be rove beetles and predator mites and nematodes and all these things in the soil that are keeping that population to a minimum. But when you're on a first cycle living soil and that isn't as balanced, or if somehow the population gets out of tilt, it can just seem like it's a disaster. And so I want you to see through that and know that there is another side where it's not so bad and it really doesn't present a problem. But when you're in the middle of it, it can be an issue, especially if you're like really like cleanliness and sterility. And so I want to address that by just saying, hey, it's a known problem for anybody growing indoors with compost and all of the amendments and top dressing. And when we started adding mulch for the first time and we were keeping it extra wet and lots of breakdown material, if you get something popping off in that mulch layer, it can be a little harder to deal with. So a lot of those products, you know, they're not meant to kill fungus gnats or their larvae, and it's pretty unbelievable how strong they are. We've even played with concoctions by making a hot water extraction of the mustard, and we've used scientific labs locally to try and balance the extract from that to try and make something that would on contact kill the fungus gnat larva, maybe eventually register it or something, but we were never able to produce something that was worthwhile. And so I'll get back to what I was about to say in the beginning. Here's the best way to completely eliminate them immediately in that container, a barrier. And so when you have like a grassroots fabric bottom container or a fabric pot, there's no holes in the bottom. If you have a black plastic container, sometimes there's holes in the bottom. And so that can be a problem where the fungus gnats can crawl up and in there. And a lot of times if you're bottom watering, that can be where one of the sources of problems are. For this particular method to work, you want to cover those holes up temporarily, and you can always undo that later. But the method is to use a barrier like sand. Sand is very affordable. You might have some in the playground in your backyard. You might be able to go to Home Depot, just grab a bag of sand. You can use Montana Grow from us because it's a volcanic mineral, but it will kind of harden up on the top. Sand is easy to water through, easy to remove. The goal is to create like a 1/2 inch to inch barrier right on top of the soil where literally nothing can crawl out and nothing can go in. The moment you do that, they're gone. Now, obviously the larva might live a little longer, but if you wait long enough and then remove the barrier, your fungus gnat issue is now gone. And because it's now gone, if one or two start to show up occasionally, it's never going to be that same population explosion problem that you had. And to do this properly, a lot of times people will remove their mulch layer, scrape it off, just get rid of it because that top inch will be where most of the larvae live. So in a big bed, you could take off an inch, discard that, work it through the worm bin, whatever you want to do, just get Just get rid of that from the grow. Then you can put the barrier in. Once that's gone, you can remove the barrier, reintroduce anything that you're accustomed to. Now, if you've got a bag of compost somewhere that you were using and you open the bag and you've kind of left it open and let it maybe you overwatered it or gnats got in there and it's a problem, you want to deal with that, because if you fix the problem here and you just keep reintroducing it, it could be an issue. The barrier is probably the absolute best way. It's cost effective and it makes an immediate difference. You can use diatomaceous earth, but it gets kind of funky to remove once it gets wet. And so I will say, if you're trying to do something like that, I will do a good watering first and then put the barrier on. And then the goal will be not to water until I remove that barrier. So it's not ideal for every situation, but it does help. Other things that you've heard, like you mentioned, even started a dry down schedule to risking my microbes, and even that didn't work. Once it's out of control, just doing a little dry down sometimes is not enough. Of course, for a long period of time, it can be great. I've had beds that I had just down in between cycles, and when I restart them up, the top was dry. By the time I get it all wet again, there's literally not one gnat in there, and it's really nice to start from scratch like that. But doing a little bit less watering in that mulch layer the entire time might be helpful. Now, we have those moisture meters, but when my canopy's dense and I know that it's likely to be moist in there, I'm not in there misting the top every day. I'm just keeping the overall battery of soil wet, and I don't want to create ideal conditions for the gnats to go out of control. And so the black belt answer is kind of like, don't get in a situation where that's that bad, and then it won't be so hard to compete. It's more of a preventative, but honestly, fungus gnats are part of the picture. And because all of the companies out there that you're gonna wanna deal with, if you go to the local Craigslist worm guy, if you go buy some heady compost from down the street, or you buy in Malibu or Ollie or any of these premium ones, Coast of Maine, anything that has a great reputation, there's still a chance that you can get some larvae, some fungus gnat issues there. And so it's best to outcompete with a good diversity. I don't recommend spending lots of money on beneficials, but really if it's a problem, a lot of people recommend using the nematodes. You water them in and it goes to town on the larva. At the same time, you're using sticky traps. At the same time, you could use a barrier. But when it comes to rove beetles, I find that I get excessive amounts of them just from living soil as it is. And so buying those in may not be as necessary. A lot of people just go to town though. They buy all the beneficials, they load them up. I feel like it's an expensive way to solve the problem and it doesn't always work. So the barrier is kind of the go-to. I hope that helps. We could have a whole conversation just on gnats alone, a whole separate episode. What I'd like to do is there's a lot of home remedies that people use. And I've noticed that people get rid of these in different ways. Immediately you're gonna have people come in and say that they used a biology product. And so you can use mosquito dunks. There's a number of ways to get this, but it's BTI, Bacillus thuringius israelis. People say they swear by it and they never have a gnat because of it. I'd really like to hear other living soil growers that know about the elephant in the room, that have dealt with gnats before, and they've been able to beat them back or come to a happy place. I want to hear your feedback on this subject. There's a lot of people out there that just have their do-it-yourself, fix for fungus gnats and a lot of the same information. I want to see if any of you have something unique, or if you've done the barrier method and it worked for you. Please comment on this video. I'd like to readdress it in the future. I think this is a really important topic for us to keep bringing up. Okay, next one, Racer. Racer says, do you ever talk about phosphate buildup in organic soils? Dr. Bruce Bugbee talked about how it's the most important issue with organic gardening. It's a really good question. We don't talk about it a lot, and I'll explain why. Let's bring it back. So when we're talking about organic agriculture, a lot of times people would use excessive amounts of manures, or they would add lots of guano or excessive amounts of organic phosphorus sources to get the yield that they're after. And that would lead to a lot of phosphate runoff or potential buildup and then leaching out. And that excessive amount in the soil and that runoff of that can cause major issues for the local groundwater, for the streams, the creeks, and for other purposes, right? Not every plant is going to grow well in higher phosphorus, and that buildup can absolutely cause issues. Now, when we first started BuildASoil, one of the things that we did differently was we're following the Coots recipe. And if you notice, there's no phosphorus input there other than using 1/3 of that potting soil as a good compost. And there's plenty of phosphorus in the compost. Now, the manures that we're using are not like a cow manure that's just absolutely loaded. There's some local compost that I can buy that are so excessive in the level of nutrients that are in them, they're almost harmful to mix into the soil. But in a really degraded soil, adding small amounts of that can add enough fertility to make a difference. And so there's a purpose for it, but using a lot of that could cause a phosphorus buildup or even phosphorus leaching into the native water tables. Now, when it comes to living soil beds, a lot of times we're not going to have this runoff concern that we'd be similarly worried about, but buildup can still occur. And so when I bring it back to the Coots recipe and where we started, in fact, I can remember sitting with Kevin from Rootwise and him talking about a 1-to-1 or a 2-to-1 or even a 3-to-1 phosphorus ratio. to potassium. And a lot of growers were really riding excessive levels of phosphorus when it came to their super soils or their living soils because they really wanted to get that big yield. And even then they'd be adding other phosphorus inputs. And so I think the way that we're running these plants and we use cover crops and other things, it can help mitigate that risk. But a lot of people are familiar with growing at a 2-to-1 phosphorus to potassium ratio. BuildASoil was always the opposite. We had less phosphorus or at most 1-to-1. And what we did differently was we would leverage mycorrhizae. Same when I was talking to Kevin about his biology product, the Rootwise. That was the way we were going to get in touch and distribute the phosphorus that had, instead of just jacking it in the soil, we were trying to keep it at a level that made sense from soil testing and then allow that to be accessed through the biology and the nutrient cycling that goes on in the soil. And it's been a really good result for us. Now the 3.0 has a little bit more phosphorus, and obviously utilizing the biology will help release it. The light has a little bit less. All of our soils have good availability, and it's something important to balancing the soil test. But none of ours have excessive amounts. So what I mean by that is when I first started doing soil testing, a lot of our customers were running super soil, and they'd run it, then they'd put it in a batch, then they'd add more, then they'd run it, then they'd add more, and they were wondering, why am I not getting the best yield? A lot of times when people were reusing super soil, it was because of excessive amounts of inputs that was causing a reduction in yield, and phosphorus and sodium and some others were really, really high in these recipes. People would add, I mean, when I'm talking like 800 to 1,000 parts per million on a soil test of phosphorus, I would see these at like 3, 4, 5,000 parts per million, significantly higher than we're used to seeing, and I think that definitely causes a problem. Build-A-Bloom is a product that I really like, but it's like, a teaspoon per gallon. And so it's a lot less likely to cause buildup than we're throwing copious amounts at it. But if you run cover crop, it can help it utilize some of that, keep it from becoming a buildup situation. You can utilize soil testing. You can also follow some of our best practices where we're not adding ingredients that have massive amounts of phosphorus all the time. Craft Blend has some phosphorus in it in balance, that 2-to-1, probably closer to 1-to-1. But the way they make the labels, it's not just nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, it's nitrogen, phosphate, and potash. And when you break that down, the percentages are slightly different. But in any case, we don't have as big of a concern of phosphate buildup when we're pulling large, heavy yielding, fast growing annual flowering plants out of the soil, as well as using cover crops, also using the amendments that aren't adding excessive amounts all the time. And so when I see guys using lots of guano, stuff that we don't use, lots of different phosphorus sources, I do get worried about it. But if you follow the BuildASoil way, it shouldn't be an issue at all. And your soil test will reveal that. Okay, these are good questions. Wow, I could go, I like the problem ones. We should do more of these. Keegan says, why aren't you vaping your herb? All right, Keegan. It says, high quality weed needs high quality consumption methods. Much better flavor, it's the 21st century. Why only use all the resources to perfect the grow but not smoke it? All right, this is a good question. I can't hate on it, but Keegan, vaping's not the best way, in my opinion. I've purchased the packs and a number of different vaporizers over the years. When I was in college, it was like a glass dome with a little metal bowl. And then I had the kind with the whip, like the little box where you'd have the whip. And those actually worked pretty well. I mean, the Volcano is one of my favorites from back in the day. But it's like a big spike and it's short-lived and it's not as overall enjoyable. I know people that only vaped. I personally don't like vaping. I also don't like carts when it comes to rosin or dabs. I have friends that make like literally solventless rosin carts they'll make without doing anything other than stabilizing that rosin and increasing the temperature to make sure that it has the right consistency for a cart. And I still don't like those. And so I just prefer to smoke out of a bong or a water pipe. I really like rolling a joint. In fact, vaping to me, when you use that whip and that method, you get a lot of the flower flavors on there, which I do agree. I really like enjoying those terps. I also notice you pick that up when you roll a J and you just do a dry rip. So before you light it, you just get a really good tasting on that, kind of like you're vaping it. And then to actually get the effect, I like igniting it. And I feel like when you burn that whole J, you get different levels of heat and different experience throughout that entire thing. And I will say too that the more I smoke and as it's become a part of my life, I'm able to pick up on a lot of the flavor differences without having to vape, but there's differences every way you smoke. I agree with that. I just personally do not like vaping flower. So maybe there's others out there that are like me. Like, I love edibles, but something about smoking flower is just special to me. So that's my answer to that. Good question. All right, Danny. Danny says, if water kills the pollen, what happens in the wild when it gets rain on it? So in the wild, when you have, let's say you had Wild would be slightly different. You'd have just plants everywhere. But let's say you had acres and it was just wall-to-wall cannabis and you never pulled males. Well, there's gonna be a release of pollen for weeks of time, not just for 1 minute during one day. And nature is smart like this. Nature doesn't put all its eggs in one basket. If nature said, hey, all of the males will produce all of their pollen in the same minute on the same day and release it, if it rained that day, there would be no production. And nature doesn't do that. So what happens instead is that pollen is released from the beginning until it peaks all the way to the end, and there's different levels of quality in that pollen as it's produced, but at least it's being released all the time. And when the wind's going and the plants are whipping, you're getting a pollen release for weeks at a time. That's why it's such a problem when hemp was out here and we'd get seeds in all of our outdoor herb because of how easy it was to get pollinated with the pollen that's being spread in from those males in the fields. Now when it rains, it might kill the pollen for that day. But some of the pollen could have interacted with the plant next to it before the rain came out. And then when the rain washes it off, it's gonna release more pollen the next day and more flowers will open and more new pollen's getting created. So that's how nature handles it. That's a really good question. Indoors, we're kind of controlling things. We're releasing pollen only at one time and then rinsing it all off and removing the pollen source so we can control things a little bit better. And I'm happy to report, I've only found like 1 or 2 seeds so far in some of the herb that I've smoked from the season 4. So it looks like what we did there did a really good job preserving that pollen, considering the fact that we had full-blown males right next to the tent. So good question. All right, Richard says, are there any soil predators that will eat any newly germed seeds, specifically a bulbous white colored bug, very tiny? Yes, these are a major problem. They're good, right? They're part of the process. But when you put a fresh seed, even in a cup of soil, but a lot of times directly sown, you can have a high level of these. And you know, I can't tell. Sometimes they just grow right through it and it doesn't matter. And sometimes I feel like they're only able to get the weakest seed. But occasionally I've had an expensive pack where more than one seed have gone and I've been very sad. I've had friends investigate this with me and it's just part of the challenge out there with dealing with living soil. Our seedling soil is a great alternative to using your living soil. Some people put just a small layer above theirs. But what can happen is you'll see what I call like a bulb mite or an orb mite. You can look those up. And it seems like, I don't think it comes with the seed. I feel like it's more in the compost. And then once you get it wet and the seed's germinating and producing enzymes, they get attracted to it. But you'll be impatiently waiting for a seed and starting to dig it around, and you'll see a couple of these little bulbous mites right on your seed. And I've had some seeds grow right through it and not care, and some that succumb to it and they die. And I can't tell you if it was damping off that killed the seed and the bulb mites were just there to take advantage of it, or if they actually caused it, but it's of concern and worth noting. So if anybody has more information on this, I like to just be a resource. I don't know it all for sure, but we've seen this. The other thing that can happen is people that have those and they are chopping and dropping a lot of material down in their bed, and that starts to run out and the population of those explode. Those can actually climb up your plant and end up in your buds. We've had a few customers have this problem. For the most part, totally avoidable by cleaning up your lowers, having good airflow, and not putting so much decay in the mulch layer all the time without any management. For the most part, when people remove that and they clean up their lowers and they have decent airflow, they no longer have any of those climbing up the plant. But that one's a really low percentage. I think the one you're mentioning with the seeds is slightly higher percentage and it's frustrating. So it is possible. It's not in your head, and I call them bulb mites or orb mites. And you can look up those terms on Google and find out a little bit more. Just like fungus gnats, just like predator mites, rove beetles, all these are part of the decay ecosystem. Another one that's really weird is the roly-polies. They're great, but if they run out of the woody, detritus, rotting, like the material that they eat, they can start stripping the stalks of your plants. They can eat seedlings and cause problems. For the most part, they don't, but they can be. Same with these things, so just be aware of that. I feel like nature doesn't have good and bad. They just have things with a job to do. And when there's a balance, it works better. But when there's an excessive of one type, it can be a problem because we're trying to get a specific result out of it. All right, next one is Dig. Dig says, hey, Jeremy, question. In the Kid Kaya farm tour video, Kurt mentioned that if he could have just one thing in the garden, it would be aerated water. As tent gardeners, what should we be doing for proper water aeration? Is spraying with a Chapin enough? And if so, does it have to be a 1949 or will a $15 plastic one do the trick? This is a series of good questions. First of all, you do not need a Chapin or anything like it. Any sprayer will work. Only reason we started getting Chapins is Coop mentioned it back in the day. A lot of us liked the idea. It became kind of like a symbol that you kind of were in on the know. You knew what was going on with the living soil forms, but it was also more durable. and it was heavy duty. 3.5 gallons turned out to be a pretty good size to water a garden with for a small grower. So for whatever reason, that stuck. But it's kind of expensive, and it doesn't need to be. You can use a regular sprayer. I really like the fan nozzle that Chapin has, but honestly, we're just getting the soil wet. That wouldn't necessarily aerate the water. It kind of will in the sense that it's spraying down and it's getting activated a little bit as it pulls through the soil. But what he was mentioning is he would use a Venturi, even on like the acreage on his farm, and that would inject air into it. Kind of how the, what is it, the Aero, what's the name of that pump, babe? Aero mixer, yeah, duh, I was thinking of the AeroPress for coffee. Okay, so we have a pump, it's called the Aero mixer, and it actually has a Venturi where there's an air tube that goes on, and when it pumps the water, it's actually injecting air from outside right into the water. So that would be one way to do it. Another way would just be to bubble your water. A lot of people use an air lift like a compost tea brewer, where it lifts the air and dumps it back in, creates that waterfall, and it's oxygenating the whole way while it's being lifted. Those are great ways to add air to water. In fact, we were thinking about building an airlift here just to bring back compost tea brewing and show what a lot of us were doing in the very beginning of Living Soil Grows. And what's funny is, now that I see this question, I remember some of my initial grows, some of the best ones that I had, I was literally brewing tea for every watering, but it was the most basic. I would literally just brew the water and add a couple things to it. I'd add some worm castings. Occasionally I'd add like literally stuff from my medicine cabinet, like little bits of herbs and stuff. But that was getting airlifted and oxygenated, and it was coming to room temperature, and that water is what I'd use every single time. And so I do think there's benefit. A big part of biodynamics is actively stirring the water and getting life to it. So as far as Kurt's concerned, he's seeing big benefits by adding air to the water. You could use an air stone, you could bubble it, you can do an air lift. I would encourage you to try it. A lot of growers at home that have chlorine in the water, they'll bubble it just to remove, by oxygenation, the chlorine that's in there. And so there's another benefit to aeration. I personally don't think it's the most important. Kurt really did say that it made a difference for him. And I think it also made a difference because he was dealing with pretty compacted agronomic soil that's hard to get air into. And so I think it makes a big difference there. So something to consider, but for sure you don't need an expensive sprayer. You may have to buy a couple of the cheap ones as they break, but honestly, it still would be a money savings, not a huge deal. Good question. All right, last question for FAQ 11, season 4, comes from Hippie. Hippie says, I'm about to harvest soon. My temps will be a little higher, maybe 76 degrees, but my humidity will be under control. I've heard of a loss of terps from higher temps. What can I do to fix this? Well, you can lower the temp. And I know that sounds foolish, like maybe there's some other way, but honestly, that's the way. And 76 is not terrible. It's not like 100 degrees out, and it's not the end of the world. But when you are drying and you have slightly warmer temps, I feel like some of the more volatile terps can be off-gassed. I think at 76 versus 60, you're not likely to have a huge difference. I think if you really slow dry it, you'll do a great job. But one of the reasons why we do cooler temperatures, besides the terpenes, now I think higher temperatures would be a problem, exposure to sunlight, things like that. But when it comes down to just the 75, 76 degrees like you mentioned, the reason why we opt for 60 is we don't want any mold growth. And because we want slow drying, we're trying to keep it closer to 60% humidity. So what I might do in your scenario at 76 degrees is maybe keep it at 60 for the first couple days, but drop it down to 55% so that we're not exacerbating the situation that could cause mold growth, especially if it's getting warmer than 76 sometimes. And you also want to check out the dew point and see at 76, it's probably not an issue, but that would be my concern, is more of a mold concern with the increased temperature, not really the terpene consideration. However, you have the right mindset. We're trying to get as close to these target numbers as possible for many reasons, mold and also taste and odor. I think 76 is probably fine. I would focus on the weakest link being that it's gonna be riskier to keep the humidity at 60 or above, or just at 60. You might wanna force it down low so you know with your warmer temperature, you're not tempting fate. So great questions. I wish I could do more. I wanna keep doing more, so keep posting up these questions and maybe we'll get to yours on camera one of these days in the near future. It's got to start with you asking first. Over the next few weeks, we're going to have some downtime while we start seeds for season 5, announce the season 5 plans, take clones for season 5. So during that time, I definitely plan on getting some more FAQ videos done. Thanks, as always, for participating. We really appreciate it. Subscribe, like, tell your friends about this. Most importantly, interact, put your questions in there so we can get to them. And until next time, I'll see you guys on the next BuildASoil FAQ video.